Well, hello everyone. We are very excited for this talk today. We're going to be talking about the virtual reality and pain treatment in patients with chronic pain or acute pain. And we have two wonderful speakers that we'll be introducing to you in this wonderful new treatment options and innovation and technology for our patients. So we're going to start with Dr. Williamson. He's an orthopedic surgeon and involved in pain medicine. Dr. Williamson is a specialist pain medicine physician. He's practicing in an interdisciplinary metropolitan, regional, and rural pain clinic in BC, and he's a professor at SIAT at Simon Fraser University, an associate professor in the Department of Anesthesia at McMaster University and School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine at Monash University in Australia. He's a chair of the Academic Pain Directors of Canada and was on the McMaster Health Forum developing a national pain strategy for Canada steering committee. He will be starting the talk on pain and virtual reality. And then after that, we will have Dr. Diane Gromala, distinguished professor, who will be talking again on the same topic. And she is a full professor in the School of Interactive Arts and Technology at SFU in Vancouver, Canada. Her expertise is to build bridges spanning technology and health between researchers, clinicians, and patients and their advocates. She is designing and building innovative interactive health technologies and is also the founding director of the Pain Studies Lab. She is a graduate of University of Michigan and graduate studies in design from Yale University. And she also completed her PhD in computer science at University of Plymouth in the UK. So if you have any questions, please use the chat. We will also have enough time for questions and answers at the end of both talks. And I will now turn it over to Dr. Williamson.
Actually, Diane's going to talk first.
Sure, I can start. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting us, Stephen and Okeanis. We'll be talking today about modifying the matrix, virtual reality, perception, and pain. And most of this takes place at the Pain Studies Lab. This is at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. We're an interdisciplinary community, and we share approaches that are patient-centered, inclusive, and we have caregivers, clinicians, and stakeholders. And we share interests in chronic pain through a bio-psychosocial framework, and that'll become evident in a moment. It takes a community to build a virtual environment. So we have pain experts, neuroscientists, computer scientists, and engineers, many grad students who range from technical to designers and media artists, and industry experts and consultants. And I will give it over to Dr. Williamson.
Good morning, everyone. And again, it's Stephen Okeanis. Thanks for the invitation to participate in this. I'll be talking really about what the definition of pain is and our latest thoughts about how we embody ourselves, define ourselves as bodies, and how within that context we then define pain. So pain is, and this is the International Association for the Study of Pain definition, it's an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with or resembling that associated with actual or potential tissue damage. And so I'll talk about briefly why there's usually, if you cut your finger, you feel pain, and that seems to be a fairly straightforward association. But with people with chronic pain, often no tissue damage can be defined. So when we talk about pain and we talk about pain and nociception as different phenomena. Pain is what we feel. Nociception is the activation of little receptors within your body that sends signals to the brain that are then interpreted as being painful. And so there is a disconnect there. Some people can have these little nociceptors activated but not feel pain, whereas other people feel pain when the nociceptors are not being activated. So there's not a linear correlation between pain and nociception. We learn the concept of pain through life's experiences. And one of the things we talk about is, given that pain is an invisible phenomenon, how do we determine whether someone has it or not? And the simple answer to that is, if they tell us they have it, then we believe them. And so the gold standard is patient self-report. Pain is considered through a bio-psychosocial framework. So what this actually means is that we think about the physical aspects. I cut my finger, I feel pain. And there's a sequence of neurological or neurophysiological events that help establish that connection. But then once somebody feels the sensation of pain, then they reacted in a different way. And so, for instance, the only way we can see the invisible phenomenon expressed is through changes in behavior. The other side of that is that there is a interaction between psychological, what we now know as psychological or define as psychological phenomena, such as mood disorders and sleep and pain. And so in people with chronic pain, probably 30% or more also have a mood disorder such as anxiety or depression, or they have a particular reaction to the pain that may tend to amplify their behavioral reaction to it. And finally, if someone has pain, it is expressed in a way that affects their interactions with society. So not only is it with partners, family members, work colleagues, and then there's a general societal cost of it. But the flip side of that, even that is a bimodal, a bidirectional phenomenon, in that the way that people express their pain is also determined then by the way that the society reacts to them. Going back to the old days, and this was René Descartes in 1664 described his concept of pain. And although this was a woodcut that was actually made subsequent to his death, he originally described someone sticking their finger in a fire, but it's been now conceptualized as sticking a toe in the fire. And when that happens, the signal is sent from the toe through the body, up the spinal cord and into the brain, where it rings a bell and the person knows they have pain. And so this is a very simplistic biological model of pain. Descartes thought that the bell was in the pineal gland because that was the only midline structure that he could define anatomically that might have been considered as pain. One of the biggest problems that happened with René Descartes is that he split pain into the concept of the body and the mind, or the body and the soul. And because he was in the time of the Inquisition, he was not allowed to talk about the effect on the mind or the soul, because that was owned by the church. And so he was a neurophysiologist, but he had to modify the way that he spoke about this so as not to be seen as heretical. And in fact, his treatise wasn't actually published until after his death because of his fear of consequences. Next slide, Diane. So the story of pain has evolved through a number of different iterations over the years. And the newest thought about it is that pain is actually a projected phenomenon. And so what happens is, the result of inputs to the brain decides that we have pain, and the pain is then projected onto an appropriate or inappropriate body location. And this can be appropriate. For instance, if you put your finger in the fire, the signals get sent to the brain interprets it as a painful sensation and then projects that pain back to your fingertip, and then at the same time train a number of responses that ultimately not only enable you to withdraw your finger from the fire, but remember that that was a painful sensation, so you don't put your finger in the fire next time. But there are lots of examples of where the body will project pain inappropriately. And so a common one is if somebody has a disc prolapse in their spine, they will feel pain in the distribution of the nerve that is impinged upon as it travels down to their big toe. And hence someone can have a problem in their spine, but project the pain onto their big toe. And of course, then the most extreme example of that is where people have pain projected onto body parts that no longer exist. And this is what we talk about with phantom limb pain. And I'll come back to that in another way shortly. But one of the phenomena that I've observed in my life as a spine surgeon was people could actually get sciatica. So this is nerve pain arising from a disc prolapse projected onto a phantom limb. So these people have multiple layers of incorrect projection of pain. Next slide, thanks. What becomes really interesting is that when we say pain is projected onto a body part is then the whole question of how do we actually constitute our body? And then how do we project pain onto it? And so the way that we see ourselves in time and space is through a process that's known as embodiment. And how this actually works is we're not entirely sure. In fact, we're only just starting to get some really basic understanding of it. But we think that really ourselves and the way we view ourselves is determined by the way the brain connects a whole lot of sensory input. And that embodiment is what we call an emergent phenomenon. So what happens is all these signals fly around in various parts of the brain, and at the end of the day, you say, I am a body in space. One of the interesting things about that is that it's not only our own personal body space, but there is a peripersonal space. So this is the space around your body that gets incorporated into your own body image. And as an example of this, I'm a tragic skier, but I incorporate these 180 centimeter planks attached to my foot within my body schema so that I'm able to ski without looking at my feet or the skis. And it's a similar, when you're writing, you don't have to look at, the way you're holding the pen to be able to write. Or if you play the piano, you're not required to look at the keys after a certain amount of training because you have incorporated the piano keyboard as part of your peripersonal space. The next thing about it is, how do we define pain? Sorry, go back a slide, please, Diane. How do we define pain? And again, this seems to be something that emerges from signals being integrated within the brain. And then how does that signal get projected onto our embodied person is largely unknown, but it's thought to be due to an overlap within the brain of the areas responsible both for the emergence of pain and our sense of embodiment. And so this is something that needs to be controlled, but we certainly know that our body can influence the way we perceive pain, and pain can influence the way we see our body. So again, there's this bidirectional connection between the matrices of neurons that enable us to embody ourselves in space and to feel the emotion of pain. Next slide, please, Dane. So what does embodiment mean? It really means how we represent our body in space and time. We talk about a body schema, which is really the subconscious, if you like, integrated neural representation of our body. And this is something that takes signals from our body to tell us where it is. And particularly when moving, it tells us that we're in motion. We have a body image, is really the way that we feel about our bodies. And given that pain is a feeling, this is part of a body image construct. We talk about agency, which is our sense of being able to control action, and presence, which is our sense of being within an environment. when we come later to talking about virtual reality, really body schema and image get wrapped up in what we call body ownership, and then agency and presence are really important parts of the virtual environment, particularly from a first-person perspective. Next slide, please. One of the things that's really interesting is what happens when there is incongruence between body image and body schema. And this is a little bit how difficult to perhaps conceptualize, but what we're saying is that you can get all sorts of strange feelings, some of which may be pain, when there is a mismatch between what one sense feels and what another sense feels, and then how that integrates with your overall sense of being a body. And I guess simple examples of this include, for instance, motion sickness, where there's an incongruence between visual and vestibular input, resulting in the feeling of nausea. And so really nausea is then projected somehow onto your embodied self and hopefully not projected anywhere else. But the same thing comes with other forms of discomfort, whether it be dizziness or it comes with pain. And so one of the things that we aim to do in a virtual reality environment is to restore congruence where there has been disruption between the body image and the body scheme. And there are clinical studies that show that when there's a sensory and a motor conflict, for instance, this can give rise to or exacerbate pain in a number of conditions, including people who have had amputations, people who've had neck injuries, and people with widespread pain disorders such as fibromyalgia. And there are symptoms of distorted body image. Phenomena such as swelling when no swelling is visible, heaviness when, for instance, feeling a limb is heavy when it's of identical weight to its partner, the mislocalization of tactile stimuli, and thermal disturbance where you feel a body part is hot or cold when, but if you actually measure the temperature, it's the same as normal. And these phenomena can either develop over a long period of time or sometimes over a very short period of time. So for instance, I can make someone feel uncomfortable by distorting their body image over a period of minutes using local anesthetic injections. And so as an example to you out there, I'm sure that many of you have had dental anesthetics where for extraction of a tooth or a filling, and you felt that your face is swollen as a result, but when you look in the mirror, it's not swollen at all. And this is an example of distorted body image because now there's incongruence between what you're looking at, you look at your face, it looks normal, and what you're feeling because we've interfered with the sensory input by using a local anesthetic. And so up until recently, before people became aware of distorted body image as a component of particular diseases, for instance, these sort of symptoms, swelling when it's not visible, heaviness when there's no difference in weight, mislocalization and thermal disturbance, were thought to be some sort of mental health disorder rather than something now we're starting to realize can be explained in neurophysiological terms. These are some of the conditions that are associated with distorted body perception. The most, perhaps most uncommon but best studied one is complex regional pain syndrome. Other things like phantom limb pain following spinal cord injury, chronic widespread pain syndromes, low back pain, osteoarthritis of the hand and the knee. And I'll come back to some of these examples later on. But this is just an early study that was done on the way that people perceive their limbs or their phantom limbs after amputation. And you can see that people will perceive their limbs as still having components present, but they can be distorted, they can be lengthened, they can be shortened, and they can be in odd positions. And as anesthesiologists, what we try and do is make sure that perhaps the last recollection someone has of a limb prior to an amputation is a normal looking limb. Very difficult to do in the context of trauma. But for instance, in complex regional pain syndrome, people typically feel their limb to be bigger than it normally is. And people with osteoarthritis often find the affected joints to be smaller than they actually are. Next slide, please. These are just some of the ways that we get distorted perceptions in pain states, and there can be distortion of internal sensations, or there can be distortions of external sensations. So, for instance, if people have got migraine, they can develop a headache disorder. They can develop sensitivity to light and sound. Otherwise, you can create all sorts of disturbances in people by blocking either through anesthesia or through disease processes sensory inputs from the limbs. And these are some of the things that we start to look at, both as a cause of a particular distorted body perception, but then looking at to see is there something we can do to restore the normal sensation, in the hope that then we can restore normal body perception. Next one. So this is just an example of distortions of body perception. And what we do is we put, for instance, a painful hand in a virtual environment using hiding the person's hand, but being able to take real-time imagery of it, and then being able to change the shape of the image by a computer until the person then says, yeah, my hand now looks and feels normal. And so people with CRPS generally feel that their affected body part is bigger than normal, so that to normalize it, we have to adjust the image so that it's smaller than the actual real image of their real hand is. And osteoarthritis of the hand is you need to stretch the hand so that they'll perceive that it's a normal size. And interestingly, when you do that, their pain goes away. And so it's different for different conditions. Some conditions, for instance, in the back, people can't actually perceive their back at all. And this is just some data that comes from similar sorts of studies, where if you take someone with hand arthritis and they perceive their hand as small, if you make it smaller in a virtual field, then they will feel that the pain gets worse. And if you make it bigger in that virtual field, they'll feel the pain gets less. The interesting thing about this, and we may be talking about the concept of dose later on, is that people get not only improvement in their pain whilst in the virtual field, but they have persistent improvements in their pain once they leave the virtual field and they're back in a real field. And so that's really exciting if we can actually then change the way their persistent pain is and then get several hours of pain relief. It means that changing someone, putting someone in a virtual field for a period of time might be something you do 2 or 3 times a day instead of taking pills 2 or 3 times a day. Next one. So what we've found is that, or come up with a concept, is distorted body images reside within distorted body space. And in order to come up with a therapeutic solution, what we try to do is we can either remove the body part from the distorted space, and this sounds strange, but you can do it. So as an example, with my patients with CRPS who feel as though, for instance, their right hand or their right upper limb is swollen when it's on the right side of them, if they cross their arm to the other side, the distorted size resolves. And when they move it back to the right side again, the hand feels swollen. They move it to the left, it doesn't feel swollen. They move it back to the right, it feels swollen. And it's a really freaky experience for them. But what's even more freaky is that in about 15% of people, when they do that and they move their distorted body part to the opposite side, so out of the distorted body space into a different body space, their hand disappears altogether. And they find that's really freaky. And I've got one family where I've got 3 generations have had the same problem with their kneecaps dislocating, and they've got each got CRPS, and they each have the same distortion of their body space. So it's interesting to speculate whether genetics has a way in the way that we construct our body space, either normally or abnormally. And then the other thing we can do is actually normalize the distorted body space. And at the moment, we've been doing things like graded motor imagery or using mirror box therapies, where you're actually hiding the abnormal hand, but looking at a mirror image of the normal one projected onto where the abnormal one would be, and using that to start rehabilitating the limb. And so this is really one area that's a very simple virtual reality environment, just using a mirror. But what we're interested in studying, and what Diane's going to talk about more, is the use of virtual reality to both correct distorted body images and or distorted body space. Next one. So what has been tried? Well, people have used virtual reality for musculoskeletal assessment, for distraction during acute pain episodes, and this is particularly in children undergoing repeated dressings for burns, for providing self-administered behavioural skill-based treatment of chronic low back pain, and for physical rehabilitation. Now, each of these ones is not really using an embodied approach, but really using the virtual field for provision of education. So what we're interested in is something a little different, is actually using immersive virtual reality environments for the treatment of particularly chronic pain associated with distorted body image. And we've got some studies that have already been done in the fields of complex regional pain syndrome, osteoarthritis and low back pain, and phantom limb pain. And so that we find we're getting early information back from those studies that certainly provide proof of concept and give us encouragement to continue. So I will stop my presentation there and hand over to Diane now, who's going to talk more about the progression of virtual reality in our studies.
Right, so where to from here? And I think this is an issue of how do we continue from here? So we've been researching this area since 1991, and I think we're in a second generation where around the world, researchers and clinicians have been, proving their concepts and coming to very similar conclusions, which is VR works as a form of non-pharmacological analgesia. We don't know how or why. So in the Pain Studies Lab, we're trying to accelerate research in the areas that Owen was talking about, and looking at how it can become feasible and adopted in sustainable ways and commercialized. Sorry. Okay, so some of our long-term strategies are important because a lot of the use of VR for pain has been focused on acute pain, but our focus is on the longer game, the long-term chronic pain. So that requires longitudinal randomized controlled trials, which we're in the middle of. And I think importantly, it requires system thinking. So instead of creating, we have 14 virtual environments. Instead of those being standalone virtual environments, we think of them as systems. And what's important about collaborating with Dr. Williamson and the rest of our team is that we bring theories that have been discussed today, come up with hypotheses, build and test virtual environments, and continually test them both in the lab, and we test the technological aspects, but also we clinically test them in a continuous way, and then with an eye toward feasibility. And another aspect that I think is really important is bridging these chasms and building communities to accelerate adoption and to sustain our ability to use VR in what I call health ecosystems, anywhere from the clinical context to people's homes. And some of the chasms are between healthcare and health research, which is a very highly structured, regulated community and practice, and we want that to be so. But then that comes up against technical communities, which have to move very fast because the technology is continually evolving. But it's very unregulated, and the two communities haven't been interacting over decades. And so that's an issue that our collaboration really helps to bridge. And our approach is user-centered. So in the technical realm, that's about a 30-year-old practice. It's a more recent idea to have patient-centered approaches in health research and clinical practices, but I think also including stakeholders, and that ranges from ministries of health to insurers in our development, so that we can ensure that, you know, the FDA knows this is coming. They know what needs to be examined and how do we validate these things. We really focus on a first person embodied model in the way that Owen was discussing, and on the long-term neuroplastic changes. So not kind of short distractions for acute pain, not one-time uses of VR, but again, for the long game, for the chronic conditions. And we're looking to commercialize that. We've been looking at feasibility studies for quite a while. And entities such as United Healthcare is looking at how we integrate VR in clinics across the US. And I think for our team, an important aspect is really searching for the mechanisms. We know that VR works. We don't know how and why it works and what its limits are, and how we can use it for long-standing neuroplastic changes. So an example is, this is Luma Path. This was created for aging arthritis patients. And in this virtual environment, it's created for range of motion, and AI helps patients. So when they can complete a range of motion kind of exercise, then it gets a little more difficult. And at the same time, it has aerobic benefits that they're usually quite unaware of. And this has, again, been tested from the technological realm to the clinical realm. And here's an example. So she's holding a controller and tracing over kind of a figure 8 aspect. And what you see in the background is, this is a steampunk ship. And so when my grad students were building this, I thought, steampunk, aging patients, is this really going to work? And we were really surprised that it was extremely popular with 70 and 80-year-old patients, particularly because we were unaware. The steampunk ship looked a lot like the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, which of course was some of their context growing up. And this is a demonstration, I think, of how important it is to know the users, which is kind of a technical tenet. And also, I think, UX, UI, or user experience and user interface. So how easy this is to use is a really important focus of ours, and we don't see it as a luxury. And my first real job was at Apple Computer in the early days in the 80s, when it was computing for the rest of us. And that was thought to be a luxury, kind of the ease of use. But I think in the clinical realm, it's really important and actually critical that it's easy to use and that nothing breaks. So currently, when I talk about these virtual environments, again, they're systems that focus on an embodiment. And what you see here is someone, the guy on the right feels like he's inhabiting this avatar on the left, which is an aging grandmother. as she's doing things in the kitchen. And so he hears her self-talk, but also his physical abilities are limited and his limbs appear to be reddened and swollen. And biofeedback is involved in much of our systems, as well as we take information from that, we visualize it, and then we show patients afterward, because again, this is for the long term. And so their day-to-day or month-by-month improvements are visible to them in multiple ways, including looking at the information on a dashboard, like a Fitbit-like dashboard. And we are developing patient-centered pain education components and other aspects like interactive interventions for menopausal women. And some of our work seems not particularly central to virtual reality, but for example, recently we worked on a COVID online vaccination booking system. But what was important for that is, I think the kind of networking with the EMR, with the electronic medical records, again, thinking of VR as an embodied system that has to fit in a healthcare ecosystem, is important. And we learned a lot about how to do that better. So in the near future, we're exploring, again, the mechanism of how and why VR works. So we're working with neuroscientists, and we've designed fMRI studies. And as soon as everyone's vaccinated, we estimate about 4 months, we'll be able to start conducting these. We have ethics and we're ready to go. And thank you. I'm going to finish the talk with a very short video to give you a sense of our environment, where we work. And it's less than half a minute. So we have a fabulous mass transit system. That's our building. It's our neuroscience colleagues. And we continually go to nonprofits like Pain BC and elder care communities. We work with physiotherapists, that's chemotherapy patients at a children's hospital. And the technical grad students are in clinics as often as possible, because if they don't interact with patients, it seems like a distraction to them. And patients like the fellow at the end, they always end up smiling as soon as they take the head-mounted display off. So, thank you. And
well, thank you. That was, both of them were amazing talks. I see that they were both very well received. And we also have a lot of questions. So I'm going to start off with a question for Dr. Williamson about the interesting sensory mismatch affects pain as well as cyber sickness. Does that vary between pain conditions? And is there a level or quality of mismatch which it has a greater or lesser impact? For example, is there a passive motion versus controller-based motion?
This might be something, in fact, Diane can contribute to more, because, but it is really interesting. I've experienced myself, and particularly changing, like I was in this environment where it was attached to Google Earth, and I was like being Superman going around Google Earth. But once I actually came down close to the Earth and had to rotate myself to land on my feet, that was when I got dreadful imbalance and dizziness. So I think, and we do know it does vary between conditions. I know there's another question coming up about this, but it seems to be the more central the phenomenon of chronic pain, the more susceptible people are to, I mean, both getting the benefit of the virtual environment, but also being more likely to develop the cyber sickness as well. And there's not been a lot of data about that, but we do know that in the limited studies that compare, for instance, things like complex regional pain syndrome with similar pain through peripheral nerve injuries, the environments, both the effect and the ill effect associated with the environments are different depending on the origin of the particular condition. So that's certainly a great question. I can't answer it any more than that, but it's certainly being able to manage the, if you like, the adverse effects of virtual reality are just important as the treatment effects. And at the end of the day, there's still about 15% of people that won't actually buy into the illusion at all. And so part of the studies that we'll need to do is what is different about the way that the brain processes signals, comparing those who can buy into the illusion or not. And that's really why we need to do more studies on the mechanisms of embodiment and the mechanisms of pain and how those two entities interact.
And in the virtual environments, for example, also what constitutes a dosage, it seems to vary among people, but also kinds of chronic pain and how long someone's been suffering from it. And we're really interested in the persistence of the VR effect, which we're just, no one's really had the time or longitudinal studies to really track that. But one of my grad students, for example, is just finishing her PhD work using VR for phantom limb pain. And one of the interesting anecdotes is that one of the fellows who had, really intractable pain after using VR over several weeks, said that he dreams that his arm and hand moves again. And then other people in the study, none of whom talked to each other, also said the same thing. So we're wondering, is it like learning a foreign language? When you dream it, is the effect kind of more deeply ingrained or working at a deeper level?
The interesting thing from that perspective of neurophysiology is that the studies that are starting to tease that out are looking at the default mode network. So this is actually the network of brain activity that occurs when people aren't involved in activities, and whether that somehow is expressed in dreams, we don't know, but it's an interesting point.
Sounds like it. That's very exciting and fascinating. Now, you can also, you mentioned about the dosing effect, Dr. Gromala. Also, there's the placebo effect. So how would you, or the Hawthorne effect? So how would you overcome that in the clinical trials, or how has it, so far in the trials?
Well, we try to be as rigorous as we can, but we often do structured reviews where we kind of look at the landscape of who's doing what and what effects people are seeing using VR. And the simple answer is we don't know yet. But I really wonder how much of this are novelty effects, because so many studies are short term, or the Hawthorne effect because, it's a common phenomena for people who have chronic pain to go for years being told that it's all in their head, or they're not being diagnosed with chronic pain, and then they suffer from social stigma. And with VR, not only do they have a new treatment option, but usually it's accompanied by interacting with at least 1 or 2 staff members in addition. So I think that's a big question we need to control for.
Yeah, yeah. So there's definitely a large amount of questions, a lot of clinical trials need to be done. And what are the cohorts and the trials that we already have? Are we looking at large numbers, or are there still
not yet. Just some of our colleagues at Cedars-Sinai just got a big NIH grant a few months ago, and that's the first time really that a large-scale VR study has been funded to that degree. Most of the time, like for example, for our longitudinal studies, we have 100 patients over 9 weeks. But more than that, it's been really difficult. But I think now there's enough evidence and enough interest where that'll expand.
Now, there's another question from the audience. Has there been any study done employing AR/MR in addition to VR in this space?
They're starting to be. So AR is more like an overlay over kind of the real space, so to speak. And one of the questions there is, what would be the mechanism of effect? Because we know VR, or strongly suspect VR works because it engages so much of our sensory and perceptual systems. With AR, your sense of presence in another world isn't really there. It's an overlay on the real world. So I think there could be really interesting effects, but in different ways. For example, especially with chronic conditions, you could see kind of moment by moment or over time on the overlay, whether you're wearing glasses or using your smartphone or some other device, you can see your progress over time. Let's say with biofeedback or with kind of gait detection. You know, at the end of the day, if you have chronic pain and lower back pain, your gait changes over the day, right? So you could kind of get information about that, but I think the mechanisms are very different, and combined, it could be really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, maybe more effective as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe this is a question for Dr. Williamson. Where do you see VR in pain and research, and also can you, in research in pain, and also can you describe in depth the intervention for osteoarthritis?
Right. So what was the first part of the question?
Where do you see VR in pain research in moving?
Yeah. Okay, so look, I think there's a great role for it, because one of there's a whole, the way that the International Association for the Study of Pain categorizes pain is nociceptive pain, which is stimulating the receptors in the periphery and generating a signal that is regarded as pain. There's neuropathic pain, which is pain that arises from disorders of the nervous system themselves. So whether that's something like sciatica or a carpal tunnel syndrome or a spinal cord injury. And then there's a new category which is called nociplastic pain. And this is really thought to be intrinsic disorders of the pain sensing system. So the first two, nociceptive pain and neuropathic pain, are really hardware problems, whereas the nociplastic pain is really perhaps thought of as a software problem to do with signal processing and the ultimate expression of those integrated signals as the sensation of pain. And so that's something that is really becoming better recognized as an entity with time, but it's very difficult to treat. I mean, how do you modify a pain sensing system? And so we know that there are some pharmacological approaches. We know that if you give somebody antidepressants for pain, it affects the way that the pain suppression part of the brain works to reduce incoming pain signals. There are various psychological interventions that are thought to be helpful, but at the moment we call them psychological. They're talking therapies, for instance, but we're getting a greater understanding about how they're associated with particular signal processing changes within the brain themselves. And then we're looking for other things because these more centrally located causes of pain are the most intractable to treat. And so really we're keeping our eyes open for all possibilities. And it seems that once we recognize that chronic pain can be associated with distortions in body space or body part, then being able to try and centrally modulate them by using a virtual environment offers an intriguing approach to that, what's a very difficult problem. So, and then get on the second part of the question is that there's some very simple mapping programs at the moment, which basically involve putting, for instance, an arthritic hand in a box so it can't be viewed, then using real-time video so the person can see the hand, but then using computer software to either enlarge or reduce the image. And if you use the appropriate software, and I can't actually remember the name off the top of my head, you can individually like stretch fingers without increasing the size of the palm there. And so there's a whole lot of different ways that people can look at that. One of my colleagues, friends and colleagues, Tash Stanton, who initially did her postdoc with Lorimer Mosley, has done some work on using this approach, simple VR approach, but without being in a VR environment, to look at analgesia in both hand arthritis and knee arthritis. So there are some published examples about that work already.
That's wonderful. That's a lot of different pain characteristics, different pain disorders, even in chronic diseases, not just depression or anxiety. We also see neurodegenerative disorders. We see a lot of pain, which sometimes we don't know where it's coming from, and it's not peripheral. So we do know that there is a central cause of this pain.
Yeah, it can be very confusing for people, but classic examples of that are post-stroke pain and also multiple sclerosis, where the lesions are in the brain, but the person comes along complaining of pain in a wrist. And unless you actually have this concept as a physician that it may be central in origin, if you don't look for it, you spend a lot of time and energy and frustration looking peripherally for a problem that is not a peripheral problem.
Correct, if you've had a thalamic stroke, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
There's another question for you. In your view, and based on your experience, does VR have potentials to be considered as a therapeutic method for acute and chronic pain in the near future? Or is it more like a side complementary intervention, adjunct, so to speak?
So from the clinical point of view, there are different mechanisms. And so, I mean, Diane can speak to it as well. But for instance, in acute pain, it seems to work more just through distraction, although there is some added value. But for instance, one of the big uses is in children with burns, where they have to have dressings changed a couple of times a day. But traditionally, they've had to be so sedated to be able to do that, that they've not been able to function. Whereas if they put in a virtual environment, then there's no hangover effect. So they spend their time during the dressing changes shooting snowmen with cannons and things, but it's a cool environment that they're in, and that's the part probably acts in addition to the distraction, is it's providing a different concept. Now, if someone had never seen a snowman before or lived in sort of central, lived in Canada and didn't actually know what snow looked like or felt like, that illusion might not work. So I don't know whether it works as well, for instance, in Australia as it does in Wisconsin or somewhere. But I think what we're looking for in chronic pain, where there's not this direct connection between sort of acute episode and the perception of pain, but it seems to be more a centrally located problem. That's why we're hoping to harness a different mechanism other than just distraction. Diane, would you like to say something more about that?
Sure. The question was about adoption and to what degree that's happening, was it?
That is correct.
I think a really good example is Dr. Jeff Gold at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. So they manage with Kids X and Disney to sustain their use of VR, especially in the emergency room with kids. And United Healthcare Group are doing feasibility studies. There are some other companies that were big pharma entities in the past and have kind of re-emerged as VR companies who build a platform and find, groups like us and try to integrate that. But right now, there's really not a business model that's sustainable. So there are kind of pockets where the use of VR is kind of moderately sustained, but it's just early days yet for that.
Definitely, there's a lot to develop. Another wonderful idea and question came from the audience about opioid crisis. Is VR used to treat opioid crisis?
There are some really interesting studies about that, and in fact, we won a award at Stanford for our idea with that. So with the neuroscience colleagues we have at SFU who work with addiction, we're looking at developing something for that aspect as well. And I think that's really promising, but again, that's another long game. It's a really tough question, and the early results are promising, but how much of that is novelty is always a question. And but I think really the important aspect we've been seeing is relapse is an important aspect. So, for example, my colleague Dr. Farnak Farzan works with people at a residential addiction recovery environment. And once they leave and have relapse, that's the really dangerous time. So we have a two-prong approach where we have the use of VR in the residential communities first, but really we're focusing on the relapse once they leave, because that's the most dangerous time. But I think really one of the big promises of VR for chronic pain and other chronic conditions is hopefully it can help with ameliorating the opioid crisis.
And it seems that it's also a matter of dosing, frequency, et cetera, like you mentioned earlier.
Right.
That's what we need to work on.
Yep.
There's one more question for Dr. Williamson about neuropathic pain, VR and neuropathic pain, and it's more of a hardware problem in the brain. So how can it actually treat it? How can VR treat this type of pain?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a combination of both. And so VR has been shown to be effective in neuropathic pain related to peripheral nerve injury, but in a different way to neuropathic pain that's more centrally located. So I think one of the challenges is going to be is that there's not going to be like the silver bullet where we come up with a virtual environment that's going to treat all pain. I think we're going to have to do lots of research, and it's going to vary as to the type of environment that may affect central processing. It may be that if we come up with the right environment that affects central processing, that's all that needs to be done. one of the things, if it is a peripheral problem, it's still worthwhile looking for a peripheral solution, because we're trying to distinguish between a normal amount of abnormal signal going to the brain versus a signal that's going that then is abnormally interpreted centrally. So it's a great question, and there is some preliminary information that VR works for both, and presumably that's because of the central component of it, but peripheral, it's not as effective for peripheral nerve injury than something like CRPS, which is more centrally driven at this stage. And it just means that we might have to use different environments for each of those conditions separately.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, both. This was a very enlightening, both of your talks were amazing and opens up a lot of questions. And it seems it's a very robust field of research and many new things to discover and apply as well. So we're a little bit over the hour. Don't want to move any more with our talk, but you can, this is a recorded session, so you can go back to view it again through our VR site. And thank you both for being here and sharing all this wonderful information.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for having us. It's been great.
Thank you, Owen, and thank you, Diane. That was wonderful. And thank you, Okeanis,